she was doing a state of mind evaluation?
That's correct.
Okay. And so you evaluated Mr. Bourgoin in person?
Yes, I did.
And when did you complete those evaluations?
I met with Mr. Bourgoin on September 7th and September 10th, 2018, at the prison where he was incarcerated, and I met for about 6.5 to 7 hours.
Okay. And prior to your evaluation, did you review any documents?
I reviewed the affidavit by the State Police of Vermont about the accident.
Okay. Anything else?
That was all I reviewed at that time.
Did you review anything about Mr. Bourgoin's psychiatric history prior to your evaluation?
No, I did not.
And why is that?
Because although I'm using psychological tests that are administered in the same way and kind of prevent bias, I wanted to go in without any preconceived notion about what other people had found. And so my practice is to wait to review the records until after I've seen the person I'm evaluating, and then I can always go back if I find inconsistencies.
And after your testing and evaluations, were you able to give an opinion about Mr. Bourgoin?
Yes.
And did you write a report?
Yes, I did.
And we'll come back to this in more detail, but can you just briefly summarize your ultimate conclusions after your evaluations?
After my evaluation, I found three main things that relate to the questions that Dr. Kapoor had asked. So in terms of the malingering related to the testing that I did, Mr. Bourgoin did not fake deficits in his cognitive function, and he also did not malinger on the psychiatric evaluations that I had given. I used particular tests to assess for malingering. In addition, I did a cognitive test, and that is the equivalent of an IQ test, actually, is the IQ test with some supplemental scales, and I also assessed personality.
So during your psychological evaluations, how did Mr. Bourgoin present?
Mr. Bourgoin was cooperative, and I will say also that from the public defender's office, the investigator, Jamie Lee Kiley, was present for the evaluation and also audio taped the evaluation, except when I asked particular questions related to the test, since that isn't allowed to protect the testing. Mr. Bourgoin was cooperative with the test, completed all of them except for one test where he said he was not able to do that. It was a test of telling stories. I did not need it for my conclusion. He presented initially with caution. That's appropriate because it's never been tested before, and I had explained to him that nothing we talked about would be confidential, and even though the public defender had sent the investigator, that what I was doing would be shared with the state's attorney. And so he was appropriately cautious that as the evaluation went on, he became more spontaneous and was more relaxed. He answered questions fully, and for the most part, his answers were organized and goal-directed. However, at times, he gave long and vague and somewhat disorganized responses. I have an example for one of the questions on one of the tests is, do you have trouble expressing your emotions? And he said, and I will note, it took me a while to memorize this, as you'll see, not generally. When it comes to emotions and feelings, overpowering in a sense of restraint, overpowering sensibility that I would ordinarily have. And that gave an example. It was kind of hard to follow. I wasn't sure what he was trying to say. When I asked him, he said, I'd rather not answer, but I act rationally. And so there were several times like that where the answers were idiosyncratic. That is, they had meaning to him, but I couldn't discern necessarily the meaning. It wasn't frequent, but it did happen several times. I noted those in my report.
Okay. And those examples you're talking about in the way that he answered questions, Did that tell you anything about Mr. Bourgoin?
It was part of information that then I used when I was interpreting the test that I had given, and it fit with the personality assessment and my conclusion on his personality.
And did you discuss with Mr. Bourgoin his background and history?
Yes, I did.
And in discussing his background, did he give examples of times where he felt that others were watching him?
He cited two examples actually. One where he described his neighbor as working for Homeland Security. And he felt that the neighbor watched him and his partner, the mother of his daughter, in their apartment or in their house where they lived. And he'd find them or had a sense that he was spying on them in a way. And the other was he felt that the mother of his partner was controlling and would interfere with decisions that were made, influencing the decisions that were made. Those are the two examples he gave.
And was there anything notable to you about this?
Again, it was consistent in a way with what the psychological tests showed on the personality assessment, and those tests indicated a borderline personality disorder with some paranoid features.
And in recounting those experiences to you, did he describe them as fact?
Yes. So he didn't describe them as a sense that he had, but more that they were true. And what I was looking for there is, could he, on reflection, identify that maybe he was over-interpreting a situation, but rather he reported them as just they were evidence of a fact that had happened.
And did you ask Mr. Bourgoin about the arrest incident?
I did not.
And why is that?
Dr. Kapoor was doing the state of mind at the time. What I was looking at is Mr. Bourgoin's organization, that is in terms of personality, his intellectual ability, and again, whether he was cooperative or feigning disorders.
Okay. So now turning to the actual evaluations and tests that you did. So first, if you could just explain, how did you select the tests that you did on Mr. Bourgoin?
So based on the question Dr. Kapoor asked, I chose a standard battery of tests that's been used in forensic evaluations and clinical evaluations. It's one I've used before, and I applied the tests according to the manuals, and I interpreted according to the manuals as well. The tests fell into different categories. So the question of malingering had malingering tests. There's one that looks at whether a person's faking psychotic disorders. That's called the Structured Interview of Reported Symptoms, or SIRS, S-I-R-S. One that looks at is a person intending to answer questions correctly, or are they just answering randomly, that is, they're not engaged, or are they faking a deficit that they have? And that test was the Validity Indicator Profile, or the VIP. And then there are validity tests built into the other personality tests I did that allowed me to determine whether or not he answered in a way that I could interpret those tests. I did the cognitive testing, which included the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the 4th edition, which is the standard, sort of the gold standard on assessing IQ. And the personality tests included the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, 2nd edition, or the MMPI, the Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory, 3rd edition, the Rorschach, and a sentence completion, and a figural drawing where he drew a person, tree, and house. Those all together constituted the personality assessment.
Okay, and the purpose of all those tests you touched on is to determine whether he was malingering, his cognitive abilities, and to assess what psychiatric conditions he had.
Along with personality structure, yes.
Okay, so now I just want to go through the results of those tests. So did your testing reveal whether Mr. Bourgoin was malingering any psychotic symptoms?
At the time I did the test on the SIRS, the score that he got on that did not indicate that he was malingering.
And did he show any exaggeration of psychotic symptoms?
No, not on that test. In fact, he denied most psychotic symptoms. In fact, all of the psychotic symptoms that ordinarily would be malingered, like do you hear voices, do you see things that aren't there, he answered no to all of those questions.
And so on the test designed to assess the validity of psychotic symptoms, what was your finding on that test?
That he was not malingering, that his description of his experience then in my opinion, was an accurate description of the symptoms that he experiences.
And was he faking bad, did you find?
So faking bad occurs on two tests. On the waist, if somebody's trying to show that they're not that bright. And he was not faking bad on that test, and the other is on the MMPI. There's a scale that indicates faking bad, that is you're trying to show that you have a lot of problems, and he did not score in that direction.
And on the test for malingering of psychiatric symptoms in general, what did you find?
Again, and that's the Miller forensic assessment of symptoms. And on that test, he answered no to all of the items, again indicating that he was not endorsing or faking symptoms at the time I was doing the test.
And on the cognitive testing, what did you find?
On the cognitive testing, Mr. Bourgoin scored in the average to high average range with an IQ in about the 118 score, which again puts him in the high average. His strongest area of thinking, of intellect, is in perceptual reasoning, and that's a subscale in which a person needs to understand shapes and patterns to interact with the environment. He also scored in the average range for verbal reasoning. His lowest score was in the processing speed, and that indicates that on time tests he was slower in processing, which corresponds often to depression. He showed no evidence of psychosis on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and that's a scale that would pick up psychosis if someone had, say, schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. He did not show that.
On the personality assessment, what did you find?
On the personality tests, all together indicated that Mr. Bourgoin matched a pattern of someone with borderline personality disorder with paranoid features or traits.
Okay, so after your evaluation and the tests, I guess if you could just go through what are your overall conclusions about Mr. Bourgoin?
So the overall conclusions in which I answered Dr. Kapoor's questions is on the testing that I did, he did not show evidence of faking or malingering a psychotic illness. He has a strength in his cognitive ability that did not match with his success in work or employment or school. And he showed borderline personality disorder.
And as a result of your finding of borderline personality disorder, was there something significant about that finding, possible symptoms that someone might have?
So borderline personality disorder, like all personality disorders, are pervasive and enduring characteristics that get in a person's way of being as successful as they can be. And borderline personality disorders are particular for emotional discontrol. That is, a person has exaggerated reactions to experiences of being slighted or to loss. There's a constant fear of being abandoned or left out. There are patterns of poor success in jobs and in interpersonal relationships, primarily not because the person can't do the task, but because they have great difficulty navigating interpersonal relations.
Okay, and what were your findings about the possibility of someone like Mr. Bourgoin becoming psychotic?
So characteristics of the borderline personality disorder include intense in response to the environment, to stressors or to loss or to trauma. Extreme emotions that interfere with organization. So for a period of time, a short period of time, a person can be psychotic. In addition, they can also show disruptive emotions where a person can become rageful. Both of those are characteristics that can happen to a person with borderline personality disorder. That's why it's seen overall as a disorder that includes a great deal of instability in a person's life.
And so in your opinion, were the results of your evaluations and your tests valid?
In my opinion, they were valid because I had the malingering tests and I had the validity indicators that were on the personality test built into the MMPI and the MCMI. And so it is my opinion that they do reflect, they're an accurate reflection of Mr. Bourgoin's intelligence and his personality structure.
And was the fact that Mr. Bourgoin was cooperative, does that fit into your analysis as to whether the results are valid?
Well, if he weren't cooperative, they wouldn't have been valid, and that would have been my conclusion that the tests were inaccurate, or the test results were inaccurate.
So he gave a sincere effort when you conducted the test?
Correct.
And he was not evasive?
He was not evasive. At times he said he didn't want to answer a question. I always say that that's certainly his prerogative, particularly when I'm working for the state. Tell them they don't have to answer if they don't want to. But he answered all the items on the test question, which was essential to scoring the test. He did answer all of those.
And after you did your testing, did you review anything at that point, anything further?
At that point, I did review Dr. Rose Marin's report, and Dr. Rose Marin had summarized a number of other records, including Mr. Bourgoin's hospital stay after the event.
And did anything that you reviewed after your evaluations change your opinion in any way?
No. In addition, I also interviewed a transcript of Ms. Kiley's interview with Mr. Bourgoin that went into a lot more detail about his background and his background and his history as an adult in work and in relationships supported a borderline pattern.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions, but the state might have a few questions.
Good afternoon, Dr. Barmaski.
Good afternoon.
I just have a few questions for you. So you met with Mr. Bourgoin for 7 hours in total, correct?
Correct.
And that was in September of 2018?
Correct.
Okay. And you found him through your testing to have been high IQ, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And with the exception of looking for any long-standing conditions, such as IQ testing, your sole purpose of that examination was to evaluate his general psychological condition at the time that you did those tests, correct?
Partly. But besides IQ, personality is also enduring. So that
Right.
would have been a long-standing one as well.
Right. But your testing was to determine those things at the time that you were doing the testing.
I determined them at the time, but to give information beyond just the testing time. That's why Dr. Kapoor wanted them.
Right. Okay. And based on those examinations, you believe that Mr. Bourgoin has borderline personality. Is that correct?
That's my opinion, yes.
Okay. And I believe you stated in your report that that could mimic bipolar disorder, but it is your opinion that Mr. Bourgoin does not have bipolar disorder, correct?
So the testing did not show bipolar disorder. However, in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, under both bipolar and borderline personality, it says that both could occur.
Right. But it's your opinion is that he does not have borderline personality
So
disorder.
the testing didn't show that, and my opinion is that it's not inconsistent, but that's not what I found.
Okay. And with regards to borderline personality disorder, you mentioned that somebody can become psychotic in the presence of emotional discontrol. I think those were your words. Is that
Yes.
correct? But that someone with borderline personality disorder can also become rageful and disinhibited, correct?
Correct.
And on the sentence completion test that you did with Mr. Bourgoin, and that's where you start a sentence and then you ask him to complete the sentence, correct?
Correct. The root of the sentence is written down, so I hand it to him. He fills in. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And so when you gave him the start of a sentence that says, "What gets me into trouble is," Mr. Bourgoin answered, "my emotions," correct?
That's correct.
So the full sentence being, "What gets me into trouble is my emotions."
Yes,
correct?
that's correct.
And when you started the sentence, "When I get mad," Mr. Bourgoin finished the sentence, "I can be aggressive," correct?
That's correct.
So when I get mad, I can be aggressive.
That's correct.
And in the 7 hours that you spent with Mr. Bourgoin, you never asked him any questions about his thinking or actions the week of the crash, the day of the crashes, or the night of the crashes, correct?
That's correct. I did not.
And you have no opinion regarding his state of mind on October 8th when he was involved in these crashes?
I have no opinion.
Okay. And you finally concluded in your report that Mr. Bourgoin is depressed and at risk of suicide, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
No further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor.
Apologize, Your Honor, just 1 second.
Your Honor, before we call the next witness, I have what's been marked as defendant AA. This is the UVM Medical Center surveillance video. The parties have agreed to admit this into evidence.
That's true, Your Honor.
Okay, so double A, UVM Medical Center videos surveillance footage?
Yes.
It didn't have anybody.
Thank you, Judge.
Okay, so I'm told that you keep your voice up, but so let me just, the exhibit, which is double A, parties agreed to admit it into evidence. This apparently is the UVM Medical Center footage. So are we about to play it? Is that what's happening?
First, Your Honor, the defense would call Joey Miller.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Could you please state your name and spell your last name for the record?
My name is Joseph Miller, M-I-L-L-E-R.
And where do you work?
I work at the UVM Medical Center.
And what do you do?
Currently, I'm a mental health technician.
And back in October 2016, what was your job then?
I worked in security.
And were you working on October 8th, 2016?
I was.
And on that day, was there a report of a suspicious incident that morning?
Yes.
And do you know who made the report?
Margaret.
And what was her report?
That there was a man in the executive hallway who didn't appear to have any purpose there.
And did you later learn the name of this man who was in that hallway?
I did.
And what is his name?
Stephen Bourgoin.
And did you personally speak to Mr. Bourgoin in that back hallway?
No.
So what happened after you heard of this report?
Another officer spoke to him in the back hallway. He came out, Mr. Bourgoin came out to the waiting room and was hanging out in the waiting room, and I spoke to him out there.
Okay, and was he doing anything in the waiting room in particular?
He wasn't doing anything strange, but he hadn't checked in as a patient or as a visitor, so I went out to find out what he was doing there and see if I could help him.
Okay, and did you have some interaction with him involving a sign that was on the wall?
I did.
And what was that?
He had been looking at a sign on the wall that was a study seeking volunteers, and I saw that he was reading it, and I offered to write the number down for him.
Okay, and what happened after that?
He accepted, and I gave it to him from my notepad that we carry, and then he left.
Okay. And so what did you do after Mr. Bourgoin initially left the ER waiting room?
My memory is a little fuzzy on this point, but I know that we in security followed his truck on the camera.
Okay, so at some point you go to the hospital security cameras?
Yes, we have a desk with camera controls right there in the waiting room.
Okay, so in real time you were monitoring Mr. Bourgoin and his comings and goings?
His goings there, yeah.
Okay. And why was that? Why were you watching him?
Because we hadn't established what he was doing in the department yet, and wanted to see what he was doing next. Sometimes people will, say that they're leaving, and they'll kind of go to the corner, and they'll turn around and go into the cafeteria or something. And just wanted to see if he was really leaving, since it wasn't clear what he was doing there.
Okay. And on these videos, you're able to manipulate the camera?
On that camera, yes.
Okay. Okay. So we have what has been marked as defendant's AA. Now I'm going to play the first video. Mr. Bourgoin. Okay, and before we keep playing the video, can you just explain to me in the layout, first of all, is that you on the video?
Yes.
Okay, and where are you coming from just then?
I'm coming from inside the patient care area of the emergency department.
Okay. Okay, so on the video, the man in the red sweatshirt, is that Mr. Bourgoin?
Yes.
And the sign that you were referring to, can you see that on this video?
I believe that it's just out of frame to the right.
Okay. And can you just describe the general layout of this area? In particular, where is that executive hallway that Mr. Bourgoin had previously been found in?
Yes. So it's changed considerably. We've been under construction. But there's the checkout desk you can see on the left there. Sorry, the check-in desk where you can get registered, give a complaint that you're going to be seen for, and they'll send you over to the waiting area, which is to the right here. And then you'd be called into triage, which is also to the right there. It's right in front of the waiting area. Around the corner is the security desk where we have an officer stationed where we can review footage and watch live cameras. And then there's also a hallway that is running alongside the emergency department. It's just offices and conference rooms. It has been locked and unlocked at different times. We've gone back and forth on whether that needs to be a locked hallway, but it is there's nothing for patients or visitors to do there. It's just offices and conference rooms. It's outside of the secure envelope of the whole patient care area. You can't access the patient care area just because you're in that hallway. And we do send people through it frequently, even today when it's locked, because it's a direct route from the emergency department to the parking garage and to several other places that people have to go frequently.
Okay, so Mr. Bourgoin didn't seem to have any business at the hospital, and you had asked him to leave?
No, people can be there for a myriad of reasons. And the first thing I determined was that he didn't want to check in as a patient, which is the primary reason, and we work hard not to discourage anybody from coming in as a patient, because of them call in because, of course, it defeats, our mission. But he said that he wasn't a patient or a visitor, so because of that, he can't be hanging out in the emergency department in the waiting room or in that executive hallway.
Okay. So after you made sure Mr. Bourgoin had left, what did you do next?
I don't recall.
Did you go to view the video security footage at that point?
Yes, while he was leaving, I watched him leave on the live camera.
Okay. So we're now going to play the next portion of the video. I just want to stop there. So, Mr. Miller, the individual you can see walking on the right-hand side of the frame, was it your understanding that was Mr. Bourgoin that you were watching?
Yes.
And I also just want to identify the time. So, when you first had encountered Mr. Bourgoin, it was prior to the 8:44 a.m. date stamp.
That sounds right to me.
Okay, and now we're at 8:44 a.m. approximately. So I'm stopping it here. Do you remember if this camera captures any more of Mr. Bourgoin?
It is a camera that can move and zoom, but I don't recall whether we went to another camera or not to get the best view.
And can you just explain what you remember about what this shows, what this video footage just showed?
If I recall, he walks to his truck and drives away.
Okay, but on this video, he didn't walk to a truck. just to pause, the individual that we just see coming onto the screen, who is that?
That's Mr. Bourgoin.
So just to pause again, so what are you doing with the camera at this point?
We're moving it and zooming it in so that we can see which vehicle is entering.
Okay, and now what are you doing with the camera?
The same. We've zoomed in on the vehicle, I believe,
And why did you do that?
so that we could make sure that we were following the right person here.
Okay. Did you get his license plate number?
I can't recall whether we recorded it or not. It's certainly on the footage here.
So what did that just show, the part we just watched?
That was his truck driving away.
Okay. And did you see a Toyota matching the description of Mr. Bourgoin's Toyota come back on camera?
I believe I did later in the day.
Okay. And so the time on this, what time was it at this point?
It looks like 8:48.
And so when you saw the similar Toyota come back, did you still follow him on your camera, the video?
I believe I did.
And so at this point, what time of day is it?
This is 9:39.
So the truck that we just saw drive across the screen, was that the Tacoma that you had previously seen?
Yes,
And that was Mr. Bourgoin?
that's right.
And just to clarify, this parking lot, what parking lot is this that we're
This is
looking
the
at?
emergency department parking lot.
Okay. And so the individual that we saw get out of the truck, is that Mr. Bourgoin?
Yes.
And where is he, what direction is he going right now?
The lower left hand there, that you're looking at the back of the emergency department sign, that's where the entrance is, and he's walking downhill away from the emergency department entrance.
And what was it that we were just watching just then?
That was Mr. Bourgoin coming back up the hill towards the emergency department.
Okay, and the area where he goes off the screen, what is right in that area?
That's the core building. Immediately out of sight, it's just brick walls. It's kind of outside of MRI. There's nothing much to do there. And then there's an entrance that comes in to the lobby where the cafeteria is.
Okay. And what about the entrance to the ER? Is that?
The entrance to the ER is here at the lower left corner of the screen.
Okay. We have one last video clip. And so is that you walking out of the door?
Yes,
And where is Mr. Bourgoin standing right now?
he's at the check-in desk.
In the emergency room?
That's right.
And so did you walk out because you saw Mr. Bourgoin?
Yes.
And what was happening with Mr. Bourgoin in the last few seconds of the video?
He registered as a patient.
And what is the time of this video?
9:44.
Okay. And so we actually have one more video. So did you then see Mr. Bourgoin one more time on October 8th?
I don't recall right now.
Okay. So we'll play this video. And again, what is this video showing?
This is the same parking lot angle. The camera's just above the entrance to the emergency department.
Okay, and what time is it at this point?
This is 11:03.
And so who is the individual who just walked out in the crosswalk?
That looks like Mr. Bourgoin.
And so on that last clip, when Mr. Bourgoin initially pulls out, what does he do?
He does a 3-point turn.
Is he going the wrong way to exit the parking lot?
There's the entrance is at the far end of the parking lot, so he starts driving towards that before he turns around and comes out the exit, which is the closer opening in that parking lot.
I have no further questions.
Sergeant.
Good afternoon. People going the wrong way in the parking lot full of construction. Had you ever seen that happen before?
Very frequently.
Okay. So you've been called down to talk to people who are in the hospital but don't seem to have a reason for being in the hospital. That wasn't the first time you'd ever done that, correct?
No, that's a typical call.
Okay, because, and you ask them, well, what is your business here? Do you want to get checked in, or are you a visitor?
Right. Depending on the area, of course, that I find them in, I try and ascertain what they're there for.
Okay, and why is it that you are concerned about people being in the hospital that have no business being there?
Well, we have a wide variety of different things that you can run into in security, and I try to approach people who seem out of place with an open mind because of the wide variety of things that can turn up. We've had some people have come in to steal a purse off of a nurse's computer. Some people are just trying to cheat the parking system, which is a lower priority, but still part of my duties. Some people are confused. Some people are intoxicated or high on drugs. We have people we've had certainly situations where staff or visitors have like a stalker or an ex-boyfriend or something who they don't want visiting them.
Okay,
Any number of things.
So your concern is both patient and staff safety?
Yes.
Okay. And did you sit in front of the camera for the entire hour that we saw shots from, looking to see if Mr. Bourgoin was going to come back?
No.
Okay. So you went back to the video from time to
At
time?
that time of day, I was, if I recall, I was at the 82 post, which is inside of the emergency department. We do have a camera-enabled computer there, but unlike the front desk where you kind of have to be stationed there all the time to check in visitors, the inside posts, you also have to round the department frequently and be in touch with patients and nurses and the charge nurse and hear about incoming ambulances and that sort of thing.
Okay. And so you're checking the cameras to see if he's coming back because you just don't want somebody in the hospital that has no reason for being there.
Well, it was still a very open-ended interaction that I had with him. Certainly by the resolution of this, when I saw that he was checking in, the questions were pretty much answered. That's okay, he's here to check in. Nothing more to that story, and he was off my radar at that point.
Okay. But the coming and going of him, as we saw here in these clips, you don't know what he was thinking, whether he was just trying to make a decision about coming into the hospital or not, correct?
Yes, it's not uncommon for someone to be unsure about whether their complaint, should be seen in the emergency department, or sometimes people have an embarrassing complaint that they're not sure if they want to, to check in and explain it to a triage nurse.
Okay. And as I understand your testimony, you asked whether he needed help, and he said no, right?
Yes, that's
Okay.
because of where he was. That's the first thing that occurred to me that he might be there for.
And he was in the executive hallway?
He was before I met him. Yes.
Okay. All right. So when you saw him, was there anything about his appearance that concerned you?
No, he was well groomed. He was clean. There was nothing out of the ordinary in his appearance.
And what about his demeanor?
He had a normal affect. He did not seem, like I talked about, the wide variety of conditions that we encounter people in. He didn't seem to have anything affecting his behavior at that time.
He didn't seem confused to you?
He didn't seem confused.
Or agitated?
No.
In fact, he was polite. You had a nice conversation with him,
Yes,
correct?
he was friendly and polite.
Okay. And you said he was looking at a poster
Yes.
on the wall. And did he ask you to write the number down for him, or did you volunteer to write the number down?
I think that I offered to write the number down because he was looking at it, and security, we always carry a notepad, so that's something that I am ready to do for people.
And it was a volunteer study, correct?
Yes.
And volunteer studies at the hospital often give money for you to participate in that study, isn't that correct?
Yes, that's the normal setup.
Okay. If in fact you had noticed or observed anything about Mr. Bourgoin that caused you concern, would you have gotten him the help that he needed?
I would have done my best to, depending on what type of behavior I observed would, influence my reaction. But we, call providers out. We do our best with a, cooperative person to try and, encourage them to ask for the help.
Okay.
If somebody appears very intoxicated, we will call the police if they try and drive off.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Good direct.
Mr. Miller, in your interaction with Mr. Bourgoin, did he seem angry to you
No.
or rageful?
No.
No further questions. Thank you.
Anything further?
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Time for a break, Your Honor.
Jury's saying yes. Okay. So we'll take our afternoon break, 15 minutes. And we'll rise.
Victoria Poulin? Good afternoon.
Hello,
State your name for the record and spell your last name.
Victoria Jean Poulin, Poulin.
Okay. Are you employed?
I am,
How?
as a registered nurse at Central Vermont Medical Center.
Okay. Were you employed as a registered nurse back in October of 2016?
Yes, sir,
Where?
at the University of Vermont Medical Center in the emergency department.
So in October of 2016, were you working as a triage nurse?
Yes, sir.
What's a triage nurse?
A nurse who accepts people from the waiting area, assesses them, asks them questions about their complaint as they come into the emergency department.
And on October 8th, 2016, did you have an occasion to meet Stephen Bourgoin?
I did.
And were you his triage nurse at the emergency department?
I was.
And before somebody gets to you at the University of Vermont Medical Center hospital, they check in at a kind of a check-in desk at the ER?
Yes.
And is that through the, kind of right through the doors, the check-in desk is there, and then the security is there as well?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Okay. And when the person is checked in, did they get coded in?
They get a complaint.
Okay. And in October 8, 2016, what was the complaint coded in for Mr. Bourgoin?
I don't recall.
All right. Would looking at his medical record from that day help refresh your recollection?
Yes, sir.
Showing you what's been marked as defendant's exhibit BB, I think we're up to, for identification. I think. Is that his medical record from that day at the emergency department?
It is.
And can you take a look at that? If you look on the first page down towards just below the halfway mark, you might see
Crisis.
Okay. So he was coded in as crisis.
Correct.
What does that mean?
Could mean any number of things.
What does it mean to you as a triage nurse when it's coded in as crisis?
It means he's there for some sort of mental health crisis.
Okay. Did you know Mr. Bourgoin prior to October 8th, 2016?
I don't believe I did.
So how it works, if I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the coding in happens and that gets electronically transmitted to you sitting in the triage area?
Yes.
All right. So tell me how it would work from when you get the electronic coding in, and take us from with Mr. Bourgoin. What happened?
I would see a word and a name. If I have no patient in my room, I would go to the door of triage and call that person's first name and invite them into my triage room.
And as you sit here today, do you have a present memory of meeting with Mr. Bourgoin on October 8th, 2016?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll ask you questions about what happened, and if you need assistance from looking at the medical record, you certainly can refer to those. So tell us what happened. You went out and called Mr. Bourgoin's name, and tell us what happened.
I recall calling his name. He rose from the waiting area, walked towards me. I invited him into my triage area. I did as I do with all patients. I introduced myself, had him come in. So I don't have direct recall of doing all the things I always do, but according to my record, weighed, did vital signs. I recall asking him why he was there.
Okay, so let's stop there. Tell me about that. What was he able to tell you why he was there?
He said that he was there for relationship concerns and some concerns related to safe housing.
Did Mr. Bourgoin have any difficulty answering your questions?
Mr. Bourgoin had some latency in his speech, some hesitation after I asked each question.
And you said he talked about relationship issues. Did he? You said he talked about safe housing. Do you remember him saying that he wanted to be somewhere safe?
Yes, he talked about safe housing.
And what happened after you asked him why he was there?
So when people come with concerns like similar to that, they land on an EPIC screen for mental health when they have a crisis as a concern. We are triggered to ask questions about if they are suicidal or homicidal. So those questions were asked of Mr. Bourgoin. He denied those questions.
And so then what did you do?
Did vital signs, asked those questions, and then asked him about pain.
And how did that go?
So Mr. Bourgoin asked me to read the sentence at the top of the pain scale on the desk.
Okay, so what happened then?
I did. I read him the sentence at the top of the pain scale that's anchored to the desk in Triage 1. When I did this, Mr. Bourgoin indicated 0 on the numeric pain chart.
Do you remember what you read to him?
I do not.
And did that seem, was that something unusual that someone would ask to read the pain chart?
It seemed unusual.
In your in the medical record, you would have typed. You did type some notes in your medical record.
I did.
And would looking at that medical record refresh your recollection about whether or not he said safe housing or safe place?
That would be helpful, yes.
And I'm going to show you what they marked as Defendant's Exhibit B. And I know you can take a look at that and tell me whether or not that refreshes your recollection.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Safe place.
Okay. And you actually put that in quotes in
I
your.
did.
Right. how was his speech?
His speech was clear. He just had some latency, so a hesitation after each question asked.
Do you remember if his sentences were disjointed and fractured in nature?
Yes.
Okay, you do remember that. You put that in your note as well.
Yes, sir.
So were you able to determine really what was the matter with Mr. Bourgoin after triaging him?
It was difficult to understand why he was in the emergency department, having concerns about a relationship or a safe place, and having no pain are not truly a reason to be in the emergency department now.
So then what would be the next step? You were then done triaging him. What's the next step?
To room him.
I'm sorry?
To put him in a room.
Okay. And then, so did you do that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so tell me about the trip from triage to the room.
So once rooming is determined, finding a space, if there is one in a busy emergency department, is the next step. Room 37 was available. I let Mr. Bourgoin know we'd be going to a room, and we stood to walk down the back hallway. It was quite busy. We traveled from Triage 1 to the entranceway for the general treatment hallway. Mr. Bourgoin encountered several people that he knew and had conversations with several on stretchers in the back hallway.
So you say several. So there were two distinct people on stretchers that Mr. Bourgoin stopped and talked to?
Yes, sir.
And then what happened?
And we continued onward to room 37. I oriented Mr. Bourgoin to the room. There was a gate, doorway down in the back part of the room that I offered to put up. It looks like a garage door in the back of the room. It covers medical equipment. So once it's up, the room becomes a regular emergency department room.
And is that one of the rooms specifically designed for mental health patients?
It is. That day it happened to be the only room that was open.
But the gate there is so if you need to put somebody in a room and they can't get to the stuff in the room to harm
It's designed
themselves.
for safety.
Right. Okay. And so when you went in the room, Mr. Bourgoin, did he mention something about that?
Many people pause at the door when they see that gate down, and they don't need to be there for any other reason if they're there for a medical reason. So I offered to lift that gate and get a warm blanket and oriented Mr. Bourgoin to the room. There's a bathroom behind that, opposite the door. So as with anyone, I oriented Mr. Bourgoin to the room, offered to go get a warm blanket, and to go get the key to raise that gate and make it a regular medical room.
And you had asked Mr. Bourgoin about whether or not he had any suicidal thoughts.
I did, in triage.
Right, and he denied.
Correct.
And then as part of the protocol, homicidal thoughts as well. And he denied that.
That's correct.
And when you get to the room and you're leaving them in the room, you don't have any concerns about his suicide, correct?
That's correct.
That's why you're willing to lift the gate up.
Correct.
So then you oriented the room, you said, I'm sorry, and then you went to get a warm blanket?
The blanket warmers at the, correct.
Okay, and then what did you do?
I returned with the key and the warm blanket, lifted the gate, left the warm blanket, again oriented Mr. Bourgoin to the room. The bathroom's across the hall. There's a warm blanket. A provider will be in shortly and exited.
And how about his clothing? Did you have him change out of his clothing? Or?
No, sir.
Okay. And did you know that Mr. Bourgoin had been at the ER, at least in the ER department, an hour before or so you triaged him?
No, sir. I was in triage.
But nobody informed you, hey, this guy was milling about the ER an hour ago before you saw him?
No.
I don't have anything else, Judge. Thank you.
Ms. Palone.
Hello.
Just as to that last question that Mr. Kadams asked you, in your time working in the emergency department, have you heard from patients before that it took them more than, that they had to think about coming to the emergency department? That they weren't sure whether or not they should come to the emergency department?
Oh, sure.
Okay. And the only way that Mr. Bourgoin would have been coded as crisis were for him to have told somebody at that registration desk something that would have triggered that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And upon your initial interaction with him, you didn't notice anything abnormal, correct?
No.
And he immediately responded when you called his name?
Oh, yes, in the waiting room?
Yeah.
Yes,
He
that's
walked up
correct.
to you
He did.
normally?
He did.
Okay. And he made eye contact with you,
He
correct?
did.
And he was dressed appropriately for the weather.
He was.
And once you're in the triage and he asks you to read the sentence on the top of the pain scale, you in fact did that for him, correct?
I did.
And that was the end of the conversation, correct?
It was.
He immediately told you he was a 0,
He didn't tell me.
Or he pointed.
He pointed to 0 on the pain
Okay.
scale.
and that was the end of the conversation.
It was.
He didn't fixate on the pain scale, correct?
No.
Okay. And you asked him in several different ways why he was at the emergency department that day, correct?
I did.
And he didn't give you any impression that he didn't know he was at the emergency department, correct?
No.
Okay. It was clear to you he knew where he was?
Yes.
Okay. And he never stated to you anything more than having some concerns about relationship issues,
Yes.
needing a safe place.
Yes.
And I believe that, didn't he also tell you that he was concerned, he had some concerns about parenting?
Yes.
Okay. And once you're going back to the exam room with him, he stopped and interacted with at least 2 different people that he knew?
Yes.
And
2 stretchers.
and those were of 2 different parties, correct?
Correct.
And was it clear to you, or it was clear to you, that they also knew him, correct?
Oh, yes.
Yes, he had an actual conversation with each of them?
He did.
Okay. And once you got him into the exam room, he voiced some concerns about this door, and you opened it, correct?
Yes. People hesitate when the garage door is down. It can be off-putting.
Okay, so it's a common complaint from patients in that room?
Yes.
Okay, so that didn't raise any red flags for you?
No.
Okay. And at no point did you tell Mr. Bourgoin that he could not stay at the hospital, correct?
No.
Okay, you would never do that, correct?
No.
And you didn't give him any sort of ultimatum about receiving treatment at the emergency department?
No.
Okay.
No.
And had he told you that he believed he was being recruited for a secret mission by the government and was inferring signs or demands from his cell phone, computer, and or lights, you would have made sure that that was addressed, correct?
That would have been in my note.
Correct.
Correct.
And it was not in your note,
It was not
correct?
in my note.
Because he did not make any of those statements to you?
He did not. That would have been closed in my note.
Yes. And you didn't put it in your notes because he didn't say it, and you did not observe any signs to give you the impression he was experiencing those things?
No, ma'am.
Thank you.
Any redirect?
Yes, would it, just briefly, would it have been relevant to you to know that Mr. Bourgoin had been at the hospital an hour before as a triage nurse?
No.
Was Mr. Bourgoin angry at all?
No.
Was he rageful?
No.
That's all I had, Judge.
Any other questions?
Nothing further, Judge.
You're all set, thank you. Okay. And you can go.
Yes, Lauren McNeely, Your Honor. state your name for the record and spell your last name, please?
Lauren McNee, MACNEE.
Okay, and are you employed?
I'm employed by the University of Vermont.
And what's your position there?
I'm a physician assistant in the emergency department.
Okay, and were you so employed back in October 2016?
Yes,
Did you have occasion to see a patient named Stephen Bourgoin?
I did.
So why don't you, do you have a present memory of meeting with Mr. Bourgoin?
I do.
So why don't you tell us about that?
I met Mr. Bourgoin Saturday morning, October 8th. I encountered him upon entering the exam room. And he was at that point changed, and the nurse was discussing the procedure of removing the clothes from his room as part of the assessment.
Okay. So just to go through it chronologically. So you enter the exam room, and Mr. Bourgoin is in the exam room with a nurse.
Correct.
And who was the nurse?
Wendy Rothrock.
And you said he was changed out of his regular clothes into something else?
He was changed into blue scrubs.
And there was some discussion going on between Mr. Bourgoin and Nurse LaFrambos?
Yes.
Okay, and what was it? What was that? What was the nature of that conversation?
Nurse LaFrambos was asking to remove the patient's clothes. He was reluctant to be separated from his personal belongings. So at that point, I intervened and allowed him to keep his belongings.
So remove his clothes. He had already removed him from his body. Remove his clothes to where? Where was she taking his clothes?
They would be stored in a secure area with patient belongings.
And what was the purpose? What was your understanding of the purpose of getting him changed?
We ask all patients to change when they come to the emergency department, both medical and psychiatric patients, and it's mostly for safety of the patient and safety of the healthcare providers.
And the room he was in, is that a regular exam room or a mental health exam room?
It's a flux room, so it has both medical equipment and the gate can be closed. There is assessed self-harm or risk to others that we can remove those dangerous objects.
And what was the status of the room when you came in it? Do you remember?
The gate was open.
So somebody had to have done that when he got in the room?
Yes, typically the triage nurse or the nurse for that patient will initiate the gate open or close based on their assessment.
And so then I think you said you intervened and said, hey, he can keep his clothes here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then what happened after that? Well, what was Mr. Bourgoin doing when you got into the room? Where was he in the room?
He was standing next to his clothes, and then after I allowed him to keep his clothes, he walked back to the stretcher and got in bed.
And did he have a blanket?
Yes.
Is that something that would be given him when he comes into the exam room, a warm blanket?
Correct.
And was there, you went in to meet with him, was there a minder or sitter involved in his care?
There was not at that point when I entered the room.
Okay, at some point later?
Yes.
So why don't we do it chronologically then? So then what happened after you entered the room? Did the nurse leave?
The nurse left.
Okay. And so then tell me about what you did.
I closed the door so we could have some privacy, and then I asked him first by telling me what brought him to the emergency department.
Okay. And what was his response?
He said he was here for physical rest.
And did you inquire further?
Yes.
Okay.
He then elaborated about different stress in his life, and he spoke about different topics, some including stress about separation from his ex-girlfriend, some about starting a new job on Monday, and the kind of associated changes in his life that were going on.
And did you ask him questions about if he was feeling suicidal?
I did.
That's part of the standard protocol.
Yes.
And what were his responses there?
His responses were no to multiple different questions in the way I phrased it.
Because you don't just ask straight out, are you suicidal? You kind of go at it
Correct.
from different angles. Did he talk to you about where he thought he was within the hospital?
He initially mentioned that he didn't realize this was the emergency department, and the way he described it meant that he didn't realize he had to go through the emergency department to be seen at the hospital. It wasn't that he didn't know where he was in the world.
He thought he was already in the hospital, not in the emergency department of the hospital.
Correct.
Did he talk about anything about wanting to be in a safe place?
Yes.
What did he say about that?
He said he came to the hospital to be in a safe place because of these ongoing psychosocial stressors in his life.
So then, what did you do?
We talked at length about those different topics. Then I questioned further about his medical history, alcohol use, marijuana use, and then we discussed kind of next steps and how to best address his concerns that he came with today.
Okay, and tell me about that discussion.
I talked to him about seeing a crisis clinician or a mental health clinician, and he declined that. And then we talked about following up with his primary care doctor to follow up on considering counseling if that was something he was interested in, or medications. And then I also provided him with the crisis mental health clinician's contact information if he wished to contact them on an outpatient basis.
And were you able to, the nurse had been in before you, correct? Wendy Laframboise?
She met the patient first in the room.
Okay. And were you able to review her note or talk with her about Mr. Bourgoin?
I talked with her, yes.
Okay. And what did she have to say about Mr. Bourgoin?
She mentioned similar things that he was describing, the anxieties and stress, and that's why he was here today.
Do you remember her saying that he had trouble organizing his thoughts?
I reviewed that from the triage note, and also Wendy described that to me, yes.
And that he had anxiety that he's finding difficult to manage now?
Yes.
And so what was the kind of the end determination between you and Mr. Bourgoin?
Well, after discussing his stress, why he was here, and various different next steps, that being seeing crisis now or following up with his doctor, since he declined to see it in the emergency department, I referred him to his primary care doctor and gave him the crisis contact information, and then he verbalized an understanding of that and was reassured, and I said I was going to leave and type up his discharge paperwork.
And you talked about a sitter coming at some point. What's a sitter, first of all, in the ER?
It's a personnel in the emergency department. Their title can vary. I believe this person was an emergency technician, and they were asked to wait outside the room to determine if I wanted to initiate constant observation on him, which I did not.
And when you were talking with Mr. Bourgoin about the different options, did the subject of his clothing come up again?
No.
His clothing remained in the room?
Yes.
And then you left to go write his discharge paperwork.
Yes.
And presumably you told him that?
Yes.
And then what happened?
And while I was typing up my discharge paperwork, Wendy came and told me, Wendy Law&Crime told me that the patient had changed and had left and never received his written discharge instructions.
And so let me ask you about the sitter. Did you discharge the sitter or when you left the room?
When I left the room, I saw the sitter there, the emergency technician there, and I instructed her that she no longer needed to be there because he was being discharged.
And so then you went to write up the discharge paperwork, and then the nurse came back and told you he's gone.
He left without his paperwork.
And did she have any discussion with you about that?
Nothing further.
Okay. You remember a discussion about should we try to find him to get him his discharge paperwork or anything like that?
It's not uncommon for patients to leave without paperwork, so unless there is important prescription or piece of information that I didn't verbalize to him, we typically don't go try to track down the patient.
Were you aware that Mr. Bourgoin had been at the hospital an hour before he entered triage, where he ended up seeing you?
I was not aware of that.
I don't have anything else to. Oh, I'm sorry. Was he angry at all?
He was not angry.
Was he rageful?
No.
Thank you.
Hello, PA Whitney. Just a few questions for you. You stated that you first interacted with Mr. Bourgoin in the exam room, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And when you first interacted with him or you first came into the exam room, he was asking not to have his clothes removed from the room, correct? And without hesitation, you allowed him to keep his clothes, correct?
I had reviewed the triage note prior, and I reviewed his medical record prior, and there was no initial risk of self-harm or harm to others, so yes, I permitted him to keep it.
Okay. But you permitted him to keep his clothes almost immediately upon
Yes.
coming into the room, right? Okay. And it's common for patients to want to keep their personal belongings with them,
Yes.
and especially if they have a wallet on them. Is that correct? And you were aware at the time that Mr. Bourgoin had his passport on him, correct?
He did not disclose that to me.
Okay. So you were aware that he had something in his possessions that he didn't want to part with.
He described his valuables.
Right. Okay. And you didn't find that request to keep his clothing odd or unusual or to be a red flag of any sort?
No.
Okay. And while this issue was being addressed, you never told Mr. Bourgoin that he had to part with these clothing or personal belongings in order to continue to be seen, correct?
No.
Which is evidenced by the fact that you actually let him keep his clothing, and he was in fact seen by you, correct?
Correct.
And when you asked him initially why he was in the emergency room, he told you for physical and self-rest. Is that right?
Correct.
And when you asked him to elaborate is when he told you that he was stressed about his long-term girlfriend, his relationship issues, their separation, and starting a new job, correct?
Correct.
And he didn't discuss this new job specifically, but you spoke with him about change being the cause of stress for him.
Yeah, he described that leaving his old job and starting a new job came with a lot of new experiences, and that was the feelings he was describing was more important.
Okay. And you noted that his mood was fine,
Correct.
correct? And his affect was fine,
Correct.
and his speech was fine,
Correct.
and his hygiene was fine,
Yes.
that his content and rate of speech were fine.
Yes.
You didn't notice any disjointed, confused, or fractured speech, correct?
Not when I spoke with him.
And he answered your questions when you asked them, correct?
Yes.
And when you specifically asked him whether he was experiencing any hallucinations, he stated that he was not, correct?
Correct.
And you specifically assessed whether or not he was experiencing any delusions, and you did not observe any indication of delusions, correct?
Correct.
And when he declined needing to contact crisis, and you told him he was being discharged, he didn't seem to have any issues or complaints about that plan, correct?
Correct.
And when you left the room to get his discharge paperwork, you told him verbally the number for crisis, and you told him that he was going to be discharged, correct?
Yes.
And again, it's common for people to leave without that discharge paperwork.
Yes.
So that didn't raise any red flags for you.
It did not.
As part of your training as a physician's assistant, are you trained to spot when somebody might be experiencing active psychosis?
Yes.
And what are some of the things that you look for, that you're trained to look for with that respect?
It's a variety of things. It's, their medical history, their social history, what they present with, but it's also what they say and how they say it. It's, their rate of speech can be very pressured or tangential, but it could also be very delayed, several minutes between answering a question. We observe for kind of responding to internal stimuli, any kind of involuntary psychomotor agitation, and then also his thought content, and that usually includes suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, any obsessions, and then paranoia and delusion.
Okay. And have you, in fact, observed individuals that are demonstrating active psychosis in the emergency department?
Yes.
Okay. And have you interacted with individuals who don't tell you that they're experiencing delusions, but you can tell that they are by the external stimuli or internal stimuli that they're responding to?
I have encountered patients who are having delusions and they don't know they're delusions.
Thank you.
If that answers your question.
Yes. And did you observe any of those cues during your interaction with Mr. Bourgoin that day?
I did not.
And if you had noticed any signs that he was overtly paranoid or delusional or actively psychotic, you would have noted that in your records, correct?
Correct.
That would have been important for you.
Yeah.
And if he told you that he wasn't sure who he could trust and he felt like he was on a mission from the government, that he was responding to lights and devices and radio signals to complete a government mission, would you have noted that?
Yes.
And that would have been important for you?
Yes.
And you would have made sure that that was addressed, correct?
Yes.
Mr. Bourgoin did not say any of those things to you during your time with him, correct?
Correct.
He did not show any signs that he was experiencing any of those things, correct?
Correct.
And again, the only things he talked to you about were stress with his long-term girlfriend and needing a safe place.
Yes.
Thank you.
Just briefly, how long did you interact with Mr. Bourgoin?
It was about 20 minutes.
Remember saying 15 to 20 minutes?
Yes,
Deposition?
15 to 20 minutes.
Nothing else, Judge?
Anything further?
No, Judge, thank you.
You can step down. Thank you.
Those are all the witnesses we have this afternoon, Your Honor.
Okay. So that'll conclude the evidence for today. I think we have a series of witnesses lined up first thing tomorrow morning. So we're going to let you go a little bit early today. Again, thank you for your patience. And I'm going to continue to plead with you to avoid all news outlets, any independent research, any sources of information, conversations with anyone about this case. I thank you for continuing to do that. So have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow morning.
Yes, thank you, Judge.